So let's unpack a scenario that practically serves as a universal stress test for the modern nervous system.
Oh, I think I know where this is going.
You probably do.
Okay.
So picture this. You are sitting on your couch. It's maybe 8:30 at night. You are shifting into a rest state, heart rate dropping. You're just watching a show.
Mm-hmm.
Then your phone lights up. You glance over to see a text message, and it contains just 4 words. We need to talk tomorrow.
The absolute worst.
Right. 0 context, no emojis, just a period at the end of the sentence.
It's brutal. And, the punctuation itself is often the most destabilizing part of that message.
Because of the period.
Yeah, exactly. In the absence of prosody, which is the tone, the pitch, and the rhythm we rely on in spoken language, a simple period shifts from a grammatical necessity to a signal of, coldness or finality.
And for you, the listener, the reaction to that message is rarely just to note the meeting and resume your evening. Right? The human brain immediately treats that ambiguity as a vacuum, and it rushes to fill it with worst-case predictive models. You spend 4 hours just overanalyzing the syntax.
You start questioning why there wasn't a standard exclamation point.
Exactly. You start running this mental audit of every interaction you've had with this person dating back to, 2019. Actively hunting for the infraction that triggered this message.
Because you are operating under the assumption that you are either getting fired or being dumped or facing some sort of catastrophic social reckoning.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are sorting through a really substantial stack of psychological research and clinical literature today to explore the hidden psychology of overthinking.
It's a fascinating topic, and we are going way beyond the simplistic idea that this is just a bad habit.
Right. The goal of this deep dive is to analyze the neurobiological mechanisms that cause our brains to catastrophize minor ambiguities. We want to examine the severe physical costs of this cognitive looping, and then unpack 3 evidence-based protocols to finally disrupt these specific neural pathways.
Because we need to look at why standard advice like, just stop worrying is neurologically impossible.
It really is.
We are dealing with highly conserved biological systems here. So by understanding the actual mechanics of rumination, we can introduce interventions that target the brain's executive functioning rather than just treating the surface symptoms of anxiety.
So let's start with the foundational hardware. When we look at this tendency to spend 4 hours analyzing a forward text message, it's so tempting to categorize overthinking as a modern-day personality flaw.
Or just a byproduct of the smartphone era.
Exactly. But the literature points to an evolutionary mismatch. Yeah. I mean, did our ancient ancestors sit around worrying about offending the tribal leader?
They absolutely did. The concept of evolutionary mismatch is critical to understand here. The neural architecture we possess right now is largely identical to the hardware that kept early humans alive in highly volatile environments.
Right.
In those environments, overthinking wasn't a pathology at all. It was hypervigilance. It was a survival mechanism.
So it's an evolutionary glitch.
Precisely. It's a survival mechanism that has just gone into overdrive. The individuals who survived and passed on their genes were the ones who constantly simulated worst-case scenarios. If an early human saw a rustling bush, the ones who assumed it was just the wind often didn't survive to become our ancestors.
The ones who assumed it was a tiger hiding behind that rock who over-indexed on the potential threat, they were the ones who survived.
Exactly.
So the modern baseline for human cognition is inherently anxious because anxiety was a massive survival advantage. We are quite literally the descendants of the hypervigilant.
We are.
But the obvious friction here is that our environment has completely changed while the hardware hasn't. We aren't living on the savannah dodging physical predators anymore, yet the brain processes a vague text message using the exact same threat detection circuitry.
That is the evolutionary glitch in action. The threat detection system is anchored by the amygdala. For listeners familiar with the amygdala's role, it's often described as the brain's emotional smoke detector.
I love that analogy. It treats a text message like a literal saber-toothed tiger.
It really does, because what the recent neurobiological data highlights is that the amygdala is incredibly fast, highly sensitive, and remarkably poor at distinguishing between different categories of threats. It processes a social threat like a potential drop in status at work with the exact same neurochemical intensity as a physical threat to your life.
It initiates the HPA axis, flooding the system with cortisol and adrenaline, regardless of whether the threat is a literal predator or just a perceived slight from a manager.
Right. And the issue isn't just that the alarm goes off. The issue is the specific failure of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to send the all-clear signal. The executive function basically gets hijacked.
Because the prefrontal cortex is supposed to provide that top-down regulation, right?
Exactly. It's supposed to evaluate the amygdala's alarm, look at the text message, and logically conclude that it's not a life-threatening scenario. But when the perceived threat is ambiguous, the prefrontal cortex lacks the concrete data required to shut off the alarm.
It can't prove you are safe.
Right. So it allows the amygdala to continue firing. The biochemical off switch gets completely blocked.
Which means we are problem-solving a phantom threat. We're deploying massive amounts of cognitive resources to neutralize a danger that hasn't actually materialized.
And that brings up a very sharp line in the source material. We have to understand the core difference between active problem solving and rumination.
Yeah, I think a lot of high-performing professionals justify their overthinking by framing it as preparation. They tell themselves they are just analyzing all the angles to be ready for the meeting tomorrow.
That framing is a very common cognitive distortion. Active problem solving is linear and dynamic. It involves identifying a concrete issue, formulating a sequence of actionable steps, and executing them. The system moves toward resolution.
But rumination doesn't do that.
Not at all. Rumination is a cyclical process. It relies heavily on the brain's default mode network, where the mind wanders through self-referential thoughts without ever generating a novel solution. You're just rehearsing the exact same scenarios, generating the same stress responses, and entirely failing to move the needle on the actual problem. It's just a mental hamster wheel.
It is essentially a computational loop that consumes energy without producing output. And we see this heavily in professional environments, not just with social anxieties, but with decision-making and productivity.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's pivot to the concept of analysis paralysis. The psychological research here focuses heavily on the modern reality of infinite choice. Knowledge workers today are often overwhelmed by having too many ideas, which can lead to doing absolutely nothing out of fear of making the wrong choice.
We are operating in environments where options are practically infinite, but our cognitive bandwidth is strictly finite. When we encounter this data asymmetry, the brain's executive function hits a bottleneck.
And the fear of making a suboptimal choice triggers that ancient threat circuitry again.
Precisely. Rather than processing the information to reach a decision, the brain enters a state of cognitive gridlock. That's analysis paralysis.
The paralysis isn't a lack of ability. It's an active defense mechanism against making an error. In many corporate cultures, the perceived penalty for a wrong decision is so high that individuals will infinitely delay the decision-making process under the guise of gathering more data.
This brings us to the perfectionist trap. The research frameworks categorize decision makers into two types to illustrate this: maximizers and satisficers.
Break that down for us.
So a maximizer operates under the compulsion to evaluate every possible variable to ensure they arrive at the objectively superior outcome. They try to maximize every decision. They honestly believe that with enough research and analysis, they can eliminate the risk of a suboptimal choice.
And the counter model is the satisficer.
Right. The satisficer establishes a set of baseline criteria for a successful outcome. They evaluate options only until they find one that meets those specific basic needs.
And at that point, they execute the decision and terminate the search process. They optimize for sufficiency rather than perfection.
Exactly. And what the data consistently demonstrates, and this counterintuitive takeaway often deeply frustrates high achievers, is that maximizers experience significantly higher rates of clinical depression, anxiety, and regret compared to satisficers.
Wow.
Even when a maximizer makes an objectively better choice on paper, their subjective experience of that choice is far worse. They end up way more miserable.
That actually makes perfect sense when you factor in the cognitive load. The psychological penalty of maximizing includes severe counterfactual thinking. Because the maximizer evaluated 50 different options, they are constantly haunted by the opportunity cost of the 49 options they rejected.
They are running background simulations of alternative realities, wondering if one of those other paths would have yielded a 2% better result.
Whereas the satisficer completely avoids that penalty. Because they terminated the search once their criteria were met, they don't have that mental database of rejected options constantly generating regret.
They reclaim the cognitive bandwidth that the maximizer wastes on post-decision rumination.
We also really need to look at the sheer biological drain of this perfectionist trap. It is exhausting to constantly strive for the perfect choice. We often talk about cognitive processes as if they are decoupled from biology, but the brain is a physical organ with intense metabolic demands.
The metabolic drain is highly measurable. The brain represents about 2% of total body weight, but it consumes roughly 20% of the body's glucose and oxygen.
That's a massive ratio.
It is. When you force the brain into sustained, high-intensity cognitive looping, trying to be perfect and processing thousands of variables to avoid a mistake, you are rapidly depleting those glucose reserves just by thinking about the work.
And that is happening concurrently with the cortisol cascade we discussed earlier. You are keeping the HPA axis engaged, elevating your cortisol levels, and burning through the fuel required for executive function.
By the time you actually sit down to execute the task, your prefrontal cortex is effectively starved of resources. You experience profound fatigue before the actual work has even begun.
It perfectly explains the phenomenon of waking up exhausted. If your brain was running threat simulations at 3 in the morning regarding a project deadline, you have already endured the physiological stress of the workday before your alarm clock even goes off.
Because the biological systems do not differentiate between the imagined stressor in the middle of the night and the actual stressor in the office.
So we have a very clear picture of the pathology here. We have evolutionary hardware, fundamentally misaligned with modern ambiguous threats. We have the massive biological drain of the maximizer mindset. It is a highly destructive loop.
It is.
Which means it is time to get off the caveman hamster wheel. Let's look at the Insight Lab section of our source material, which outlines 3 specific evidence-based solutions to disrupt these mechanisms. Step 1 is cognitive diffusion.
Cognitive diffusion is a brilliant technique. It addresses the way human beings fuse their identity and their reality with their internal linguistics. When someone is trapped in an overthinking loop, their internal monologue usually sounds like, "I am worried about this project," or "I am incredibly anxious."
The phrasing implies an absolute reality.
Yes, it collapses the distance between the observer and the psychological event. The intervention here requires a deliberate shift in language. Instead of stating, "I am worried," the protocol dictates that you state, "I am having the thought that I am worried."
That tiny change creates such essential distance. It reminds the brain that you are merely the observer of the thought, not the thought itself.
By inserting the phrase, "having the thought that," you are utilizing language to restructure your neurological relationship with the stimulus. You are forcibly activating the metacognitive networks in the prefrontal cortex. You observe the thought as a transient event rather than accepting it as an objective truth about who you are.
I understand the framework there, but how does the empirical data support the idea that changing a few words actually rewires the neural pathways? Doesn't it just feel like playing semantic games with yourself?
It can feel that way at first, but the fMRI data provides a very clear answer. When an individual achieves that semantic distance, we can actually observe a downregulation in amygdala activity.
Really?
Yes. By acknowledging the thought as merely thought, you strip it of its threat value. The amygdala stops signaling for cortisol because you have successfully categorized the input as internal mental weather rather than an external predator. This semantic game literally alters the biochemical output of the brain.
That is incredible. And that structural shift sets up step 2 perfectly, which is the 5-minute worry window. The source material describes this as intentionally scheduling your anxiety.
This is an application of stimulus control therapy. The objective is compartmentalization.
Right. So for instance, you give yourself exactly 5 minutes, say at 5 p.m., to worry as hard as you can with the mandate that you must write it all down. And once those 5 minutes expire, the window is closed.
When an individual allows rumination to occur continuously throughout the day, the brain associates all environments, the desk, the car, the bed, with anxiety. The entire day becomes a trigger. By scheduling it, you train your brain that there is a designated time and place for processing.
It keeps the brain from doing it at 3 a.m. It's a boundary-setting exercise for the nervous system.
Exactly. If I start experiencing severe rumination at 10 a.m. regarding that vague text message, the protocol isn't to suppress the thought.
Because suppression leads to a rebound effect where it becomes more intrusive.
Right. The protocol is to defer it. I acknowledge the thought, but I file it for the 5 p.m. appointment. The deferral trains the brain's inhibitory pathways. You prove to your executive function that you have the capacity to delay the processing of phantom threats.
And writing it down during that window forces the brain out of the emotional centers and into the logical motor control centers. You can only write so fast, so it limits the velocity of the anxiety.
It does.
That translates beautifully to step 3, which is the 5-5-5 rule. This is a brilliant framing trick designed to immediately alter the perceived scale of the threat. When you catch yourself overthinking, you force yourself to answer 3 questions. Will this matter in 5 days? 5 months? 5 years.
This uses psychological distance to change the way we evaluate an event. When a threat is perceived as immediate, the brain processes it at a highly emotional level.
The 555 rule forces temporal distancing. If you receive the "we need to talk tomorrow" text, the immediate reaction is catastrophic. But when you ask, will this matter in 5 years? The logical apparatus has to acknowledge that the statistical probability of that is extraordinarily low.
It recalibrates the amygdala's smoke detector.
If the answer is no, you must stop giving it 5 hours of your day. You are artificially generating the context that the ambiguous text message lacked.
Precisely. You take a macro-level perspective that provides the prefrontal cortex with the logical justification it needs to send that all-clear signal.
So we have cognitive diffusion to create semantic distance, the 5-minute worry window to build structural boundaries, and the 555 rule to enforce temporal distancing. But to close out the solutions, the expert literature points to one ultimate antidote, the greatest psychological trick of all. The natural enemy of overthinking is simply action.
Overthinking is entirely dependent on the abstract. It requires the vacuum of the unknown future to sustain itself. The moment you initiate an action, you collapse that wave function of infinite possibilities into a single concrete reality. You provide the brain with new, definitive data to process.
As long as you are internally debating how to respond to an email, the brain can generate infinite permutations of failure. But the second you type a response and hit send, the rumination network is forced offline.
You shift from simulating threats to interacting with reality. And behavioral activation triggers a different neurochemical feedback loop. Completing a task generates a dopaminergic response which gives you actual energy.
Which stands in direct contrast to the glucose draining process of rumination.
Exactly.
To summarize the key takeaways for you listening, understanding your brain's evolutionary glitches is the first step. The pathology of overthinking is not a character deficit. It's just your hardware trying to keep you alive.
But you have to recognize the physical drain of being a maximizer.
Right. So the call to action for you this week is to think about the one thing you are overthinking right now. Use these tools, cognitive diffusion, the worry window, the 555 rule, to debug those thoughts. And remember that taking action, even just replying to that vague text message, is the best way to break the cycle and reclaim your energy.
And that leaves us with a final thought to ponder. If action is the natural enemy of overthinking, and overthinking is rooted in our evolutionary drive to avoid mistakes and maximize survival, is the ultimate modern life hack simply giving yourself permission to confidently make the wrong choice sometimes?
That is a fascinating concept.
By deliberately acting as a satisficer in low-stakes situations, by choosing to be wrong or imperfect and observing that the catastrophic consequences do not materialize, you systematically prove to your own nervous system that the tiger isn't real.
Giving yourself permission to make the wrong choice just to prove the tiger isn't real. That is a profound framework to explore. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.